We found, says the narrative, different houses where we could repair our sails, salt our provisions, construct two boats, lodge the naturalists and geographical engineers, and the governor kindly lent us his own for the establishment of our observatory. We enjoyed as much liberty as if we had been in the country, and in the market and arsenal we found the same resources as in the best European ports. Cavite, the second town of the Philippine Islands, and the capital of the province of the same name, was then but a miserable village where only Spanish military and government officers resided. But although the town was nothing but a mass of ruins, it was nonetheless a port, and afforded the French every possible resource. Upon the morrow of his arrival, La Perouse, accompanied by de Langle and his principal officers, paid a visit to the governor, reaching Manila by boat. The environs of Manila are delightful, he says. A most beautiful river flows through it, separating into different canals, one of which leads to the famous Bay Lake, which is distant 7 leagues in the interior, surrounded by more than 100 Indian settlements in the midst of a most fertile territory. Manila, built upon the shore of the bay of that name, which is more than 25 leagues in circumference, is at the mouth of a river navigable as far as the lake in which it rises. It is probably the most fortunately situated town in the whole world. Provisions are found there in the greatest profusion, and very cheap, but clothing, European cutlery, and furniture fetch an enormous price. Want of competition, the prohibitive tariffs, and commercial restrictions of every sort tend to make the productions and manufactured goods of India and China at least as dear as in Europe. And although the various duties on imports bring to the treasury some 800,000 piasters, the colony costs the Spanish government at least 1,500,000 francs per annum, which are sent from Mexico. The immense possessions of the Spanish in America have prevented the government from bestowing much attention upon the Philippines. They are still like the possessions of great lords, which remain uncultivated, though they might provide fortunes for many families. I do not hesitate to state that a great nation with no colony but the Philippine Islands, supposing that colony to be as well governed as possible, need not envy all the European colonies in Africa and America. Upon the 9th of April, after having heard of the arrival at Macau of M. d'Entrecasteaux, who had come from Mauritius with the contrary monsoon, and received dispatches from Europe by the frigate La Subtile, Guyot, midshipman, and Ligobian, naval officer, and a reinforcement of 8 sailors, the 2 vessels set out for the coast of China. Upon the 21st, La Perouse sighted Formosa, and at once entered the channel which separates that island from China. He discovered a very dangerous bank unknown to navigators, and carefully examined the soundings and approaches. Shortly afterwards he passed in front of the bay of the ancient Dutch fort of Zeeland, where the capital of the island, Taiwan, is situated. The monsoon was unfavorable for ascending the channel, and La Perouse therefore resolved to pass to the east of the island. He rectified the position of the Pescadores Islands, a mass of rocks which assume various shapes, reconnoitered the small island of Batal Tabacozima, where no navigator had landed, coasted Kainan Island, which forms part of the Kingdom of Lichen, whose inhabitants are neither Chinese nor Japanese, but appear to be of both races, and sighted Hoapinsu and Tioisu Islands. The latter form part of the Lichen archipelago, known only through the letters of Father Gaubel, a Jesuit. The frigates then entered the Eastern Sea and directed their course to the channel which divides China and Japan. La Perouse there encountered fogs as thick as those which prevail upon the coast of Labrador, with variable and violent currents. The first point of interest before entering the Sea of Japan was Quelpert Island, first made known to Europeans by the shipwreck of the Sparrow Hawk upon its coast in 1635. La Perouse determined its southerly extremity and surveyed it for a distance of 12 leagues. It is scarcely possible, he says, to find an island of pleasanter aspect. A peak of about 4,500 feet high, visible at a distance of 18 or 20 leagues, rises in the center of the island. The land slopes gently from thence to the sea, so that the houses look like an amphitheater. The soil seemed to be highly cultivated. By the aid of our glasses, we clearly made out the divisions of the fields. They are in very small allotments, which augurs a large population. The different shades of the various cultivated patches give a very agreeable variety to the view. The explorers had ample opportunity for taking the longitude and latitude, which was the more important, as no European vessel had navigated these seas, which were only indicated upon the maps in accordance with the Chinese and Japanese maps published by the Jesuits. Upon the 25th of May, the frigates entered the Channel of Korea, which was minutely explored, and in which soundings were taken every half hour. As it was possible to keep close inshore, it was easy to observe some fortifications in the European style, and to note all their details. On the 27th, an island was perceived which was not to be found upon any map, and which seemed to be about 20 leagues distant from the coast of Korea. It received the name of Dagelet Island. The course was now directed towards Japan, but it was very slow on account of the contrary winds that prevailed. On the 6th of June, Cape Noto and the island of Tsushima were discovered. Cape Noto, upon the Japanese coast, says La Perouse, is a point on which geographers may rely. Reckoning from it to Cape Kona on the eastern coast, the position of which was determined by Captain King, the width of the northern half of the empire may be ascertained. Our observations have the greater value for geographers as they determine the width of the Gulf of Tartary, to which I now directed my course. Map of the coast of Asia. Upon the 11th of June, La Perouse sighted Tartary. He made land precisely at the boundary between the Korea and Manchuria. The mountains appeared to be 6,000 or 7,000 feet high. A small quantity of snow was visible on the summits. No trace of inhabitants or cultivation could be seen, nor was any river's mouth found upon a length of coast extending for 40 leagues. A halt would have been desirable, to enable the naturalists and lithologists to make observations. Up to the 14th of June, the coast had run to the N.E. by N. We were now in 44 degrees lat, and had reached the degree which geographers assign for the so-called Strait of Tesse, but we were 5 degrees farther west than the longitude given for this spot. These 5 degrees should be taken from Tartary, and added to the channel which separates it from the islands north of Japan. Whilst coasting along this shore, no sign of habitation had been perceived. Not a pirogue left the shore. The country, although covered with magnificent trees and luxuriant vegetation, appeared to be uninhabited. On the 23rd of June, the Boussole and the Astrolabe cast anchor in a bay situated in 45 degrees 13 N lat, and degrees 9 E long. It was named Ternay Bay. We burned with impatience, say La Perouse, to reconnoiter this land, which had occupied our imagination ever since we left France. It was the only portion of the globe which had escaped the indefatigable activity of Captain Cook, and perhaps we owe the small advantage of having first landed there to the sad event which ended his days. This roadstead was formed of 5 little creeks, separated one from the other by hillocks covered with trees of a more delicate and varied green than is to be seen in France in the brightest spring. Before our boats reached the shore, our glasses had been directed to the coast, but we perceived nothing but stags and bears, quietly grazing. Our impatience to disembark increased at the sight. The ground was carpeted with plants similar to those of our climate, but more vigorous and green. Most of them were in flower. At every step we found roses, red and yellow lilies, lilies of the valley, and almost all our field flowers. The summits of the mountains were crowned with pines, and oak trees grew halfway up, decreasing in size and vigor as they neared the sea. The rivers and streams were planted with willows, birches, and maples, and skirting the larger woods we saw apple trees and azaroles in full bloom, as well as clumps of nut trees, the fruit of which was beginning to form. Upon returning from a fishing excursion, the French met with a Tartar tomb. Curiosity induced them to open it, and they found in it 2 skeletons lying side by side. The heads were covered with stuff caps, the bodies were wrapped in bear skins, and from the waists hung several little Chinese coins and copper ornaments. They also found half a score of silver bracelets, an iron hatchet, a knife, and other things, amongst which was a small bag of blue nankeen filled with rice. Upon the morning of the 27th, La Perouse left this solitary bay, after depositing their several medals, with an inscription giving the date of his arrival. A little further on, more than 800 cod, which were at once salted, were caught, and an immense quantity of oysters with superb mother of pearl were also obtained. After a stay in Saffron Bay, situated in 47 degrees 51 N lat, and degrees 25 E long, La Perouse discovered, upon the 6th of July, an island which was no other than Saghalien. The shore here was as wooded as that of Tartary. Lofty mountains arose in the interior, the highest of which was called Lammen Peak. As huts and smoke were seen, M. de Langle and several officers landed. The inhabitants had recently fled, for the ashes of their fires were scarcely cold. Just as the French were re-embarking, after leaving some presents for the natives, a pirogue landed 7 natives, who showed no signs of fear. Amongst them, says the narrative, were 2 old men with long white beards, dressed in stuff made from the bark of trees, very like the cotton drawers worn in Madagascar. Two of the seven natives had coats of padded nankeen, differing little in shape from those of the Chinese. Others wore long gowns, which were fastened by means of a waist belt and some little buttons, so that they had no need of drawers. Their heads were bare, but one or two of them wore bearskin bands. They had their forelocks and faces shaven, but the back hair kept about 8 or 10 inches long, in a different fashion from the Chinese, however, who leave only a round tuft of hair, which they call penti sec. All had sealskin boots with the feet artistically worked a la Chinese. Their weapons were bows, spears, and arrows tipped with iron. The oldest of the natives, to whom the others showed the most respect, had his eyes in a dreadful state. He wore a shade round his head to protect them from the sun. These natives were grave in manner and friendly. M. de Langle appointed a meeting for the morrow. La Perouse and most of his officers attended. The facts they learned about these Tartars were important, and decided La Perouse to pursue his discoveries further north. We succeeded in making them understand, he says, that we wished them to draw their country and that of Manchuria. One of the old men then arose, and with the point of his spear traced the coast of Tartary westward, running nearly N and S. To the east, vis-a-vis in the same direction, he represented his island, and placing his hand upon his breast, made us understand that he had indicated his own country. He left an opening between his island and Tartary, and pointing to our vessels, showed us by signs that they could pass through it. At the South Island he delineated another, and left a second opening, indicating that this too was a route for our ships. His quickness in understanding us was great, but not equal to that of another islander, about 30 years of age, who, seeing that the figures traced on sand were rubbed out, took one of our pencils and some paper. He traced out his island, which he called Tichoka, and made a line for the little river upon the shore of which we were, placing it 2/3 of the length of the island from north to south. He then drew Manchuria, leaving, as the old man had done, a strait at the extreme end, and to our surprise he added the river Saghalian, the name of which the natives pronounce like ourselves. He placed the mouth of this river a little to the south of the northerly point of his island. We afterwards wished to ascertain whether this strait was very wide. We tried to make him understand our idea. He caught at it at once, and, placing his two hands upright at a distance of 3 inches one from the other, he made us understand that he meant to indicate the width of the little river which formed our watering place. And then, holding them wider apart, he indicated that the second width was to represent that of the river Saghalian, and, separating them still more, he gave the breadth of the strait which divides his country from Tartary. M. de Langle and I thought it of the greatest importance to ascertain whether the island we were coasting was that to which geographers had given the name of Saghalian, without guessing its extension southwards. I ordered all hands on board, and prepared to sail in the morning. The bay in which we had anchored received the name of Langle, from the captain who discovered it, and was the first to put foot on land. In another bay upon the same shore, called Esting Bay, the boats landed close to 10 or 12 huts. They were larger than those we before had seen, and were divided into 2 rooms. That at the back contained the stove, cooking utensils, and the bench running all round. That in front was absolutely bare, and probably destined for the reception of strangers. The women fled when they saw the French land. 2 of them, however, were caught, and whilst they were being reassured, time was found to sketch them. Their faces were peculiar but pleasant. They had small eyes and thick lips, the upper one being painted or tattooed. He traced the coast of Tartary. He traced the coast of Tartary. M. de Langle found the natives gathered about 4 boats that were loaded with smoked fish, which they were helping to put in water. They were Manchurians from the shores of Saghalian River. In the corner of the island was a kind of circus, planted with 15 or 20 stakes, each surmounted by the head of a bear. It was supposed, not without some show of reason, that these trophies were intended to perpetuate the memory of a victory over this wild beast. Quantities of codfish were obtained upon this coast, and at the mouth of the river a prodigious quantity of salmon was caught. After reconnoitring the bay of La Jonquière, La Perouse cast anchor in Castor's Bay. His water supply was nearly exhausted, and he had no more wood. The further he penetrated into the strait which separates Saghalian from the continent, the more the depth diminished. La Perouse, recognizing that he could not double the island of Saghalian by the north, and afraid of not being able to leave the defile in which he now found himself excepting by the Strait of Sangar, which was much further south, determined to remain only 5 days in Castor's Bay, a period which he absolutely needed to take in provisions. The observatory was set up in a small island, while the carpenters cut down wood, and the sailors filled the water barrels. The huts of these islanders, who call themselves Orachis, says the narrative, are surrounded by a drying ground for salmon, which were exposed to the sun upon perches, after having been smoked for 3 or 4 days at the stove which is in the center of the hut. The women who have charge of this operation take them, as soon as they are smoked through, into the open air, where they become as hard as wood. The natives joined us in our fishing with nets or hooks, and we saw them voraciously devouring the head, gills, and sometimes the skin of raw salmon, tearing it up very cleverly. They sucked out the mucilage, much as we eat oysters. Their fish seldom reach the shore without having first paid toll, unless the catch is very large, and the women show the same eagerness to seize upon the whole fish, and in the same ravenous way devour the mucilaginous parts, which appear to be their tidbits. These people are revoltingly dirty. It would be impossible to find a race farther removed from our ideas of beauty. In height they are less than 4'10", their bodies are emaciated, their voices are weak and shrill like children's. They have projecting cheekbones, bleared and sunken eyes, large mouths, flat noses, short and almost beardless chins, and olive skins, shining with oil and smoke. They allow their hair to grow long and dress it somewhat in the European style. The women wear it loose over their shoulders, and the description we have given applies to them as well as to the men, from whom they are scarcely to be distinguished, except for a slight difference in their apparel. The women are not subject to any labor, which, as in the case of the American Indians, might have accounted for the inelegance of their appearance. All their time is occupied in cutting out and making their clothes, in drying fish and nursing their children, whom they suckle to the age of 3 or 4 years. It rather astonished me to see a child of this age, who had been shooting with bow and arrows, beating a dog and see, throw himself upon his mother's bosom, and take the place of an infant of 5 or 6 months who was lying asleep upon her knees. Typical Orachis. Typical Orachis. Facsimile of early engraving. The Bichis and the Orachis confirmed much of the information which La Perouse had already obtained. From them, he ascertained that the northern point of Saghalien was connected with the continent merely by a sandbank, on which grew seaweed, and where there was but little water. This concurrence of testimony left no room for doubt, especially as he never found more than 6 fathoms in the canal. There remained but one point of interest to determine, and that was the survey of the southern point of Saghalien, which he had only explored as far as Langle Bay in 47 degrees 49. Upon the 2nd of August, the Astrolabe and the Boussole left Castor's Bay and returned southwards, successively discovering and reconnoitering Monaran Island and Langle Peak, doubling the southern point of Saghalien called Cape Crillon, which led to a strait between Okujesso and Jesso. This they named after La Perouse. Hitherto, the geography of this part of the world had been most fanciful and imaginary. Sanson was of opinion that Korea was an island, and that Jesso, Okujesso, and Kamchatka existed only in imagination, whilst Delisle insisted that Jesso and Okujesso were merely an island, ending at Sangar Strait. And lastly, Buach, in his Considerations Geographiques, page 105, says, Jesso, after being placed first in the east, then in the south, and finally in the west, was at last found to be in the north. To this confusion, the discoveries of the French expedition were destined to put an end. La Perouse had some intercourse with the natives of Crillon Cape, and stated that they were handsome men, far more industrious than the Orachis of Castor's Bay, but less liberal in their dealings. They have, he says, one most important article of commerce unknown in the channel of Tartary, from which they derive their riches, namely whale oil. Of this they collect considerable quantities. They extract it in a way which is far from economical. They cut the flesh into pieces and dry it upon a slope in the open air by exposing it to the sun. The oil which flows from it is caught in vessels made of bark or into bottles of dried sealskin. After sighting the Cape Arnaver of the Dutch, the vessels coasted along the barren, treeless, uninhabited country in possession of the Dutch Company, and shortly reached the Kurile Islands. They then passed between Marican Island and the Island of the Four Brothers, calling the strait the finest amongst the Kurile Islands, through which they penetrated La Boudeuse. On the 3rd of September, the coast of Kamchatka was reached. This coast was uninviting enough. There the eyes rest painfully, and often fearfully, upon enormous masses of rock, which are already covered with snow in the beginning of September, and which never appear to have had any vegetation. 3 days later, Avacha Bay, or the Bay of St. Peter and St. Paul, was reached. The astronomers at once proceeded to take observations. The naturalists made the perilous and arduous ascent of a volcano, some 8 leagues inland, whilst those of the crew who were not engaged upon the vessels gave themselves up to hunting and fishing. Thanks to the welcome accorded by the governor, their pleasures were varied. We were invited, says Laperos, to a ball which the governor wished to give to all the women, whether from Kamchatka or Russia. If the ball was not large, it was at least mixed. 13 females, clothed in silk, 10 of whom were natives of Kamchatka, with large faces, small eyes, and flat noses, were seated upon benches round the room. Both they and the Russians wore silk handkerchiefs wrapped round the head, in a way similar to those worn by mulattoes. The ball opened with Russian dances, the airs for which were very lively, and like those of the Cossack dances given a short time since in Paris. These were followed by Kamchatka dances, which were comparable only to the convulsionists of the famous tomb of Saint Medard. The dancers of this part of Asia scarcely require legs, they make such vigorous use of the shoulders and arms. The impression made upon the spectators by the convulsive and contorted movements of the Kamchatka dancers is painful, and is rendered more so by a pitiful cry which escapes them at intervals, and which is the sole music by which they measure their time. The exertions they made are so formidable that they are completely covered with sweat, and at the conclusion they lie upon the ground unable to move a limb. The exhalations from their bodies permeate the atmosphere with the smell of fish and oil, so strong as to be disagreeable to the unaccustomed nostrils of Europeans. The arrival of a courier from Akatsk interrupted the ball. The news he brought was pleasant for everyone, but particularly for La Perouse, who learned that he was promoted. During their stay in this port, the navigators found the tomb of Louis Delisle de la Croix, member of the Academy of Sciences, who died in Kamchatka in 1741, upon his return from an expedition undertaken by command of the Tsar for the survey of the American coast. His fellow countrymen honored his memory by placing an engraved copper slab over his grave. They paid the same homage to Captain Clerk, Captain Cook's second in command and successor. Avacha Bay, says La Perouse, is certainly the best, most commodious, and safest to be found in any part of the world. The entrance is narrow, and forts might easily be constructed to command vessels entering it. The anchorage is excellent, the bottom muddy, and two large harbors, one on the eastern shore and one on the west, would hold all the vessels of the French and English navy. The Boussole and the Astrolabe set sail upon the 29th of September, 1787. M. de Lesseps, vice-consul for Russia, who had accompanied La Perouse thus far upon his expedition, was charged to return to France by land, at that time a most perilous journey, and to convey dispatches from the expedition to the government. The question now arose of finding land discovered in 1620 by the Spaniards. The two frigates passed south of 37 degrees 30, some 300 leagues, without finding any trace of it. Crossing the line for the third time, they passed the site given by Byron as that of the dangerous islands, without finding them, and upon the 6th of December, entered the Navigator Archipelago, the merit of discovering which belongs to Bougainville. The vessels were at once surrounded by pirogues. The natives who manned them did not give La Perouse a very favorable idea of the beauty of the inhabitants. I saw but two women, he says, and they had no delicacy of feature. The younger, who may have been 18 years of age, had a frightful ulcer upon her leg. Many of these islanders were covered with sores, which may have been the commencement of leprosy, for I noticed two men, whose ulcerated and swollen legs left no doubt as to their malady. They approached us fearlessly and unarmed, and appeared as peaceable as the natives of the Society or Friendly Islands. Upon the 9th of December, anchor was cast off Mauna Island. Next day the weather was so promising that La Perouse resolved to land to take in water, and then set sail at once, as the anchorage was too bad to admit of a second night's stay. Every precaution having been taken, La Perouse landed, and proceeded to the spot where his sailors were obtaining water. Captain Langle penetrated to a small creek about a league from the watering place, and this excursion, from which he returned delighted with the beauty of the village he had seen, was, as will be seen, the cause of our misfortunes. Upon the shore, meantime, a brisk trade was going on. Men and women sold hens, parrots, fruits, and pigs. At the same time, a native, getting into one of the sloops, possessed himself of a hammer and commenced dealing vigorous blows upon a sailor's back. He was speedily seized by four strong fellows and thrown into the sea. La Perouse penetrated into the interior, accompanied by women, old men, and children. He enjoyed a delightful excursion through a charming country, which rejoiced in the double advantage of a soil which required no culture, and a climate in which clothing was superfluous. Breadfruits, coconuts, bananas, guavas, and oranges afforded a wholesome and sufficient nourishment to the inhabitants, while chickens, pigs, and dogs, which lived upon the surplus fruits, afforded the necessary change of diet. The first visit passed over without serious danger. There were a few quarrels, it is true, but thanks to the prudence and reserve of the French, who kept on their guard, they did not amount to anything serious. La Perouse had given orders to re-embark, when M. de Langle insisted upon sending for a few more casks of water. He had adopted Captain Cook's views. He thought fresh water preferable to all other things which he had on board, and as some of his crew showed signs of scurvy, he was right in thinking that every help should be given them. La Perouse from the first had a presentiment against consenting, but he yielded when M. de Langle persisted that a captain is responsible for the health of his crew, that the spot which he named was perfectly safe, that he himself would command the expedition, and that 3 hours would suffice for the work. M. de Langle, says the narrative, was a man of so much judgment that his representation influenced my decision more than anything else. Next day, 2 boats, under command of M. Boughton and M. Mouton, conveying all the sufferers from scurvy, under charge of 6 armed soldiers, and a captain, in all 28 men, left the astrolabe to be under M. de Langle's orders. M. de Langle was accompanied in his boat by M. de Lorraine and M. Collinet, who were invalids, and M. de Varignas, who was convalescent. M. de Gaubion commanded the sloop, M. de la Martiniere, M. Lavant, and the elder Recevoir were amongst the 33 persons sent by the Boussole. The entire force amounted to 61, and those the picked men of the expedition. M. de Langle ordered everyone to be armed with guns, and 6 swivel guns were placed in the sloop. M. de Langle and all his companions were greatly surprised when, instead of a large and commodious bay, they found a creek filled with coral, which it was only possible to reach through a tortuous channel, where the surf broke violently. M. de Langle had only seen this bay at high tide, and as soon as this new sight met his view, his first idea was to regain the former watering place. But the friendly appearance of the natives, the number of women and children he observed among them, the quantities of pigs and fruit they offered for sale, put his prudent resolutions to flight. The water casks of the 4 boats were landed quietly, the soldiers keeping order upon the shore, and forming a barrier which left a free space for the workers. But this peaceful condition of affairs did not last long. Many of the pirogues, having disposed of their wares to our vessels, returned to the shore, and, landing in the bay of our watering place, it was soon entirely filled by them. In place of the 200 natives, counting women and children, whom de Langle had found an hour and a half previously, there were now, at the end of 3 hours, 1,000 or 1,200. M. de Langle's situation became more perilous every moment. He succeeded, however, seconded by M. de Varignas, M. Boughton, M. Collier, and Gaubion, in embarking the water casks. But the bay was almost dry, and he could not hope to get his boats off before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. However, followed by his detachment, he attempted it, and leading the way with his gun and the soldiers, he forbade firing until he should give the order. He felt that he would soon be forced to fire. Already stones were flying, and the Indians who were in shallow water surrounded the sloops for a distance of at least 200 yards. The soldiers who were already in the boats tried in vain to drive them back. M. de Langle was anxious to avoid beginning hostilities and fearful of being accused of barbarity. Otherwise he would, no doubt, have ordered a general discharge, which would effectually have scattered the multitude. But he believed he could subdue the natives without bloodshed, and he was the victim of his humanity. Very soon a storm of stones, thrown at short distances with the force of a sling, struck almost all who were in the sloop. M. de Langle had only time to discharge his gun. He was thrown over and unfortunately fell outside the sloop. He was at once massacred by more than 200 Indians, who assailed him with clubs and stones. As soon as he expired, they fastened him by one arm to the sloop, no doubt with a view to despoiling the body. The sloop of La Boussole, under M. Boughton, was run aground within 4 yards of that of the astrolabe, and parallel between them was a narrow channel not yet occupied by the Indians. By this outlet, all the wounded who were fortunate enough to avoid falling into the open sea escaped by swimming. They reached our boats, which fortunately had remained afloat, and we succeeded in saving 49 out of the 61 men who had composed the expedition. M. Boughton had imitated M. de Langle. He would not fire, and only gave orders for a discharge after his commander's shot. Naturally, at the short distance of 4 or 5 paces, every shot killed an Indian, but there was no time to reload. M. Boughton was knocked down by a stone, and fortunately fell between the 2 stranded boats. Those who had escaped by swimming towards the 2 boats had received many wounds, mostly on the head, whilst those who, less fortunate, had fallen overboard upon the side near the Indians, were killed instantaneously. The safety of 49 of the crew is due to the good order which M. de Varignas was wise enough to maintain, and to the punctuality with which M. Mouton, who commanded the boats of the Boussole, carried out his orders. The boat belonging to the astrolabe was so overloaded that it grounded. The natives at once decided to harass the wounded in their retreat. They hastened in great numbers towards the reefs, within 6 feet of which the boats must necessarily pass. The little ammunition which remained was exhausted upon these savages, and the boats at last emerged from the creek. La Perrouse's first idea was naturally to avenge the death of his unfortunate companions, but M. de Boughton, who, although severely wounded, retained all his faculties, begged him to desist, representing to him that if by any mishap one of the boats ran aground, the creek was so situated, being bordered with trees which afforded secure shelter to the natives, that not a Frenchman would come back alive. La Perrouse remained for 2 days upon the scene of this terrible disaster, without being able to gratify the vindictive desires of his crew. No doubt, says La Perrouse, it will appear incredible that during this time 5 or 6 pirogues left the shore, bringing pigs, pigeons, and coconuts, and offering them in exchange. I was forced to control myself, or I should have disposed of these natives summarily enough. It may readily be supposed that an event which deprived La Perrouse of a large number of officers, and of 32 of his best sailors, was calculated to upset the plans of the expedition. At the slightest approach of danger, it would now be necessary to destroy one frigate in order to arm the other. But one course remained for La Perrouse, to set sail for Botany Bay, reconnoitering the various islands he passed, and taking their astronomical positions. Upon the 14th of December, Oyalava, another island belonging to the same group, and which Bougainville had seen from a distance, was sighted. It was larger than Tahiti, and exceeded that island in beauty, fertility, and in the number of its inhabitants. The natives resembled those of Mauna in every particular, and quickly surrounded the 2 frigates, offering the multifarious productions of their island. It appeared that the French must have been the first to trade with them, for they were quite unacquainted with the use or value of iron, and preferred a single colored bead to a hatchet, or a nail 6 inches long. Some of the women had pleasant features and elegant figures, their eyes were gentle, and their movements quiet, whilst the men were wild and fierce in appearance. Pola Island, also belonging to the Navigator Archipelago, was passed upon the 17th of December. Probably the news of the massacre of the French had already reached this people, for no pirogue approached the vessels. Coconut Island and Scoutons Trader Island were recognized upon the 20th of December. The latter is divided by a strait, which the navigators would not have perceived, had they not coasted close inshore. About a score of natives appeared, bringing the finest coconuts La Perrouse had ever seen, with a few bananas and one small pig. These islands, which Wallis calls Boscon and Keppel Islands, and which he places 1° 13, too far west, may also be considered part of the Navigator Archipelago. La Perrouse considers the natives of this group as belonging to the finest Polynesian race. Tall, vigorous, and well-formed, they are of finer type than those of the Sandwich Islands, whose language is very similar to theirs. Under other circumstances, the captain would have proceeded to explore Oyalava and Pola Islands, but the memory of the disaster at Mauna was too recent, and he dreaded another encounter which might end in massacre. Painful associations, he says, met us with every succeeding island. In the Recreation Islands, east of the Navigator Archipelago, Rogween's crew had been attacked and stoned to death. At Trader Island, which was now in sight, Scoutons' crew were the victims, and in the south was Mauna Island, where we ourselves had met with so shocking a calamity. These recollections affected our way of dealing with the Indians. We now punished every little theft and injustice severely. We demonstrated by force of arms that flight would not save them from our vengeance. We refused to allow them to come on board, and threatened to punish all who did so without permission with death. These remarks prove that La Perrouse was right in preventing all intercourse between his crews and the natives. We cannot sufficiently praise the prudence and humanity of the commander, who, in the excited condition of his men's minds, knew how to curb the desire for vengeance. From the Navigator Islands, the route was directed to the Friendly Archipelago, which Cook had been unable to explore entirely. Upon the 27th of December, Vavau Island was discovered, one of the largest of the group, which had not been visited by the English navigator. As large as Tonga Tabu, it is higher, and not wanting in fresh water. La Perrouse reconnoitered many of these islands, and entered into relations with the natives, who, however, did not offer sufficient provisions to make it worth his while to trade. He therefore resolved upon the 1st of January, 1788, to go to Botany Bay, following a route not yet attempted by any navigator. Pulstart Island, discovered by Tasman, or rather the Rock of Pulstart, for its entire length is but a quarter of a league, presents but a steep and broken appearance, and serves only as a resting place for seabirds. On this account La Perouse, having no reason for remaining, wished to hasten on to New Holland, but there was another power to be consulted, the wind, and by it La Perouse was detained for 3 days before Pulstart. Norfolk Island and its 2 islets were sighted upon the 13th of January. La Perouse cast anchor within easy distance of shore, intending to allow the naturalists to land and inspect the productions of the island. But the waves broke with such violence upon the beach that landing was impossible. Yet Cook had landed there with the greatest facility. An entire day was passed in vain attempts and was quite unproductive of scientific results. Next day La Perouse started afresh, and upon entering the roadstead of Botany Bay, encountered an English vessel, under command of Commodore Phillip, who was engaged in constructing Port Jackson, the embryo of that powerful colony which in our day, after only a quarter of a century's growth, has attained to such a height of civilization and prosperity. Here the journal kept by La Perouse terminates. A letter, written by him from Botany Bay, upon the 5th of February to the naval minister, informs us that he intended building 2 sloops to replace those which had been destroyed at Mauna. All his wounded, amongst them M. Lavox, the surgeon of the Astrolabe, who had been trepanned, were perfectly recovered. M. de Clenard had assumed command of the Astrolabe, and had been succeeded upon the Boussole by M. de Monti. In a letter of 2 days later date, giving particulars of his intended route, La Perouse says, I shall regain the Friendly Islands, and carry out the instructions I have received with regard to the northern portion of New Caledonia, to Santa Cruz de Mendana, to the land south of the Arsacides of Serville, and to the Louisade of Bougainville, and also ascertain, if possible, whether the latter constitutes a portion of New Guinea, or is a separate continent. At the end of July, 1788, I shall pass between New Guinea and New Holland by some other channel than the Endeavour. That is to say, if there be another. During September and the early part of October, I propose to visit the Gulf of Carpentaria and the eastern coast of New Holland, as far as Van Diemen's Land, so as to allow of my return to the north in time to arrive at Mauritius in the beginning of December, 1788. Not only did La Perouse fail to keep the rendezvous he himself appointed, but 2 entire years passed away, and no news whatever of his expedition were received. Although at that epoch France was passing through a terrible crisis, the interest of the public in the fate of La Perouse was so intense that it found vent in an appeal to the National Assembly from the members of the Society of Natural History in Paris. Upon the 9th of February, 1791, a decree was passed enjoining the fitting out of 2 or more armed vessels to be sent in search of La Perouse. It was argued that had shipwreck overtaken the expedition, a number of the crews might still survive, and that it was only just to carry help to them as soon as possible. Men of science, naturalists, and draftsmen were to take part in the expedition, with the view to obtaining valuable information for navigation, geography, and commerce, as well as for the arts and sciences. Such were the terms of the decree to which we have alluded. The command of the expedition was entrusted to Vice Admiral Bruni d'Entrecasteaux, who had attracted the attention of government by his conduct in India. 2 vessels, the Recherche and the Esperance, the latter under the orders of M. Huon de Kermadec, ship's captain, were placed at his command. The staff of these vessels comprised many officers who later attained to high military positions. Amongst them were Ross, Willaumez, Trabriand, La Grandière, Lainel, and Jurien. Amongst the men of science on board were La Billardière, naturalist, Bertrand and Pearson, astronomers, Ventinat and Rich, naturalists, Budimps Boper, hydrographer, and Juveny, engineer. The vessels were stocked with provisions for 18 months and a quantity of merchandise for trading purposes. Leaving Brest upon the 28th of September, they reached Tenerife upon the 13th of October. An ascent of the famous peak followed as a matter of course. La Billardière noticed a phenomenon which had already been observed by him in Asia Minor. His figure was reflected upon the clouds below him, opposite to the sun, in every color of the rainbow. Upon the 23rd of October, the necessary provisions having been shipped, anchor was weighed, and the start made for the Cape. During the cruise, La Billardière discovered that the phosphorescent appearance of the sea is caused by minute globular animalculae, floating in the waves. The voyage to the Cape, where the vessels arrived upon the 18th of January, 1792, was barren of incident if we accept the unusual quantity of bonitos, or tunny, and other fish that were met with, and a small leakage which occurred but was quickly remedied. At the Cape, 500 Entrecasteaux found a letter from M. de Saint Felix, commanding the French forces in India, which seemed likely to upset all his plans and exercise an unfavorable influence upon the expedition. From this communication, it appeared that two French captains from Batavia had stated that Commodore Hunter, in command of the English frigate Sirius, had seen, near the Admiralty Islands in the Pacific Ocean, men dressed in the European style and in what he took to be French uniforms. It is clear, wrote M. de Saint Felix, that the Commodore was convinced they were the remnants of La Pérouse's company. When 500 Entrecasteaux arrived at the Cape, Hunter was still in the roadstead, but within 2 hours of the arrival of the French vessels he weighed anchor. This conduct appeared very strange. The Commodore had had time to hear that the vessels just arrived were those sent in search of La Pérouse, and yet he had made no communication to the commander upon the subject. But it was soon ascertained that Hunter had declared himself quite ignorant of the facts stated by M. de Saint Felix. Were they then to be regarded as unfounded? Incredible as M. de Saint Felix's communication appeared, 500 Entrecasteaux could not suppose so. Portrait of 500 Entrecasteaux. Portrait of 500 Entrecasteaux. Facsimile of early engraving. The naturalists had availed themselves of their stay at the Cape to make many excursions in the neighborhood. La Billardière had penetrated as far into the interior as the short stay of the frigates in the roadstead permitted. Anchor was weighed upon the 16th of February, and 500 Entrecasteaux decided upon reaching the southern seas by doubling Cape Horn and steered for the passage between St. Paul and Amsterdam Islands. Captain Valming had discovered these islands in 1696, and they had been recognized by Cook in his last voyage. When the Recherche and the Esperance passed St. Paul Island, it was enveloped in a thick smoke, through which the summits of the mountains were visible. The forests were on fire. Upon the 21st of April, the two vessels entered a bay upon the coast of Van Diemen's Land, which was supposed to be Adventure Bay, but which in reality was Storm Bay. The extreme point of this bay was named after 500 Entrecasteaux. Wood was easily obtained there, and fish was very abundant. Amongst the magnificent trees of the country, La Billardière mentions various species of the eucalyptus, the many uses of which were then unknown. The hunting parties caught black swans and kangaroos, creatures also but little known. Upon the 16th of May, the vessels left the port, and made for a strait, afterwards named after 500 Entrecasteaux. M. Cretin and M. Oreibau, says the narrative, were encouraged to land by the sight of fires close to the shore. They had gone but a short distance when they came upon 4 natives, attending to 3 small fires by which they were seated. They took to flight on seeing the strangers, in spite of every friendly demonstration, leaving the lobsters and shellfish which they had been broiling. As many huts as there were fires were close by. One of the natives, in his hurry, left a small basket, full of pieces of silica, behind him. He was not afraid to return in search of it, but approached Cretin with a bold air, possibly owing to his confidence in his own strength. Some of these savages were naked, and others wore only a kangaroo skin upon the shoulders. In color they were nearly black, they had woolly hair, and allowed the beard to grow. They came upon 4 natives. Upon leaving 500 Entrecasteaux Strait, the vessels proceeded to survey the southwestern coast of New Caledonia, which La Pérouse should have visited. A portion of Pine Island, which stretches to the north of that country, was the first to be recognized. The Recherche narrowly escaped destruction upon the coral reefs which surround the coast, leaving only a narrow passage between them and the mainland. At the northern extremity, several mountainous islands and detached rocks were perceived, which rendered the navigation extremely dangerous. The navigators, grateful for their escape, named them the Entrecasteaux Reefs and Huon Islands. The survey of this perilous coast lasted from the 16th of June to the 3rd of July. A true service was thus rendered to geographers and navigators, though it was, perhaps, the least profitable part of the voyage of discovery. As the favorable season was now approaching, 500 Entrecasteaux determined to avail himself of it to reach the land of the Arsacides, which had been seen by Surville, and visited some years later by Shortland, who, imagining he was making a new discovery, named it New Georgia. Upon the 9th of July, says La Billardière, towards 4:30, we perceived about 10 miles to the NW a rock called Eddystone, We took it at first as Shortland had done for a sailing vessel. The illusion was the greater, as in color it much resembles the sails of a ship. A few shrubs crown the summit. The land of the Arsacides opposite this rock is steep and covered with large trees. After rectifying the position of Eddystone rocks and that of the Treasury Islands, which are 5 in number, though so close together that Bougainville took them for one island, 500 Entrecasteaux coasted Bougainville Island. It is separated from Bauca Island by a narrow strait and is covered with plantations. It appeared to be well populated. Some trade was done with the natives, but nothing would induce them to venture on board the vessels. The color of their skins, says La Billardière, is nearly black. They are of medium height and wear no clothes. They are muscular and strong. Although their features are not pleasant, they are very expressive. They have large heads and broad foreheads. Their faces, especially in the lower part, are flat. They have thick chins, rather prominent cheekbones, flat noses, large mouths, and thin lips.